Hey everyone, so this is a Christian versus Protestant update. We do want to do these once in a while. If any of the Protestant Christians that we discuss in this series happen to reply to our videos, we'll gladly take a look at what they're saying and we'll share that with you. So we did a video a couple weeks ago about Mr. James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries, and we explained how he was teaching falsely about John 6:44. If you haven't seen that video, the link is in the description. We're actually going to summarize a lot of it in this one, so if you haven't seen it yet, you can probably get by without watching it before this one. Anyway, it seems like James might be a little confused about what we're saying in our video, so we'll try to make it even clearer in this one. And again, just as we've said before, Mr. White is a fellow Christian. He holds Protestant views, and those Protestant views happen to conflict with actual Christian views. So here we go.
I think he's trying to rebuild his audience and wants to use me to do that. And so I'm not going to play his stuff or identify him. I'm just not going to be used to help him to accomplish his goal.
All right, so Mr. White has this theory that we're trying to use him to grow our audience. That's not the case. We don't care if Mr. White doesn't mention our channel name or if he doesn't play our video in his video. That doesn't matter to us either way. But this whole story behind why he's not using our video, I kind of think there might be another reason why he's not showing his audience what we had to say. Because as we'll see as this video goes on, he doesn't even tell his audience what we actually said. He read one slide that we used in our video. He read it out of context, and he read it incorrectly. So sorry if I don't believe this whole, I'm not playing his video so I don't advertise for him. It's probably more likely that he didn't show our video because his audience is smart enough to realize, oh, that makes sense. So anyway, here's what Mr. White says he's going to do instead of playing our video.
What I will do is I will look at the primary argument.
He never actually does that. If he did that, that would be great. He doesn't have to use our name. He doesn't have to play our video. He could just say what we were saying. We don't need credit for anything. We just want to see him address the flaws in his theories. So anyway, we'll come back to what Mr. White claims was our primary argument in a few minutes. But right now we're going to look at what our actual primary argument was, which we repeated over and over again in the original video. This is Christian versus Protestant on John 6:44.
Verse 44, every person drawn by the Father is raised up on the last day.
That is not taught in the Bible. What few Christians believe is Mr. White's edited version of Jesus' words. James is making it say, everyone has to come to me if the Father who sent me draws him. I am not the first Christian to point this out.
And in John 6:44, all those who are drawn are raised up by the Son.
None of that is in the single verse that James has quoted.
Being drawn by somebody doesn't mean that you're automatically going to be given. You can be drawn and then not given to the Son. The Bible does not rule out that possibility. Now to Mr. White, if you're watching, does John 6:44 really say this?
Every person drawn by the Father is raised up on the last day.
So that was our primary argument. Mr. White is taking one verse, one single verse, John 6:44, the verse that we indicated in these huge bold letters, which some might call a cutesy graphic.
Doing cutesy graphic stuff.
Mr. White is taking that one single verse and says that it teaches something that it doesn't actually teach. Mr. White has continually taught that John 6:44 says this.
In John 6:44, all those who are drawn are raised up by the Son. Every person drawn by the Father is raised up on the last day.
Even on Twitter, in response to our video, he claims, all drawn by the Father are raised by the Son. That is the clear and irrefutable statement of the text. So again, the primary argument in our video was that John 6:44 by itself does not teach that all drawn by the Father are raised up by the Son. We asked him, would you be willing to at least admit that John 6:44 doesn't say this by itself? And we'll ask him this again now. We're also going to make one slide that Mr. White can use. That way, if he actually wants to respond to what we're saying, he doesn't have to use our name. He doesn't have to play our video. He can just use this slide. And we'll send a screenshot over on Twitter. That way you never have to mention us. But here's that slide. Mr. White, do you agree with us that John 6:44 by itself, without using any other verses, leaves open the possibility for there to be people who are drawn by God who will not come to Christ? It's a simple yes or no. Yes, you do agree. Or no, you don't agree. If yes, you do agree with us, then please explain which other verses you need to use to arrive at the conclusion that all those who are drawn are raised up by the Son. And then finally, if no, you don't agree, then please explain how John 6:44 teaches this on its own. So that's all we're asking at the moment. Baby steps here. Now, Mr. White, I know you refer to some of the information, the examples we give in our videos as fluff.
Fluff.
So feel free to skedaddle if you want. For anyone who is interested in watching some more, feel free to continue. All right, so the entire argument in our video focused on one thing. It's important to note that in the video that Mr. White is talking about, we were not proving a Christian teaching at all. We were simply disproving a false teaching. The false teaching that we were disproving was that John 6:44, that single verse, teaches that every person drawn by the Father is raised up on the last day. That is the exact same thing that Trent Horn pointed out to Mr. White when Mr. White said this during a debate.
None of that is in the single verse that James has quoted.
So Mr. Horn is telling him the same thing. What Mr. White is claiming is taught in that verse is not taught in that verse. But don't just take my word for it and don't take Mr. Horn's word for it, because we can be wrong just like Mr. White can be wrong. Actually, look at what the verse says. It says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day." So let's use an analogy. No one can come to my party unless my dad gave an invitation to him, and I will raise the roof with him on my birthday. This tells me about the people who come to my party and how I'll raise the roof with them. It also gives me the added detail that the people who came to my party were also invited by my dad, so I can say that all the people who came to my party were invited by my dad, but using just this single verse, I cannot say that everyone who was invited by my dad came to the party. Because the verse leaves open the possibility that my dad could have invited people to the party, and then they didn't come to the party. Now, if we treat this verse in the same way that Mr. White is treating John 6:44, then we would have to say that everyone who gets invited by my dad has to come to my party. And that's simply just not taught in the verse. Mr. White is changing the words around to make it say what he wants it to say. He's not respecting the possibilities which the Bible leaves open. Now, Mr. White wrote to us on Twitter in response to this video, and he says, "The two occurrences of him in the verse are coextensive. No reason exists for separating them or giving them different reference." To which we replied, "At no point did we separate the two occurrences of him or give them different reference." And we asked him, "So are you capable of actually addressing our points, or are you going to continue to make stuff up?" Because this is what Mr. White does. And Patty Bonds, the sister of Mr. White, has explained this as well.
I knew too much about the faith. I knew what I was watching was someone do a very good job of destroying a church that didn't exist.
Explain that. That's interesting the way you said that he was doing a good job of destroying a church that didn't exist.
Well, his arguments against the church are based on misunderstanding of what the Catholic Church actually teaches and believes. But he does a superb job of defeating the arguments he perceives to be what the church is.
So this is pretty typical behavior for Mr. White. He doesn't interact with your actual belief. He'll create a belief that he thinks he can easily refute, then he'll apply it to you and say, "This is what you believe," and then he'll try to refute the thing that he just made up and applied to you. So again, maybe this is why he's not showing clips from our video in his video, because he can't find clips of us saying any of the things that he's making up for us, because they simply just don't exist. Anyway, so Mr. White is claiming that the two hymns in this verse refer to the exact same group of people. And we never said that they didn't refer to the same group of people, so yeah, let's just go with that. Let's say that both of these hymns are referring to the exact same group of people. This hymn would be equal to the people who come to Jesus and who are also drawn, and we'll note the fact that it never says that these are the only people drawn by God, just that these people who are coming to Jesus were drawn. And the reason we're pointing that out is because if I said, "No one can listen to my Our Lips Are Sealed CD unless they have a CD player," that doesn't mean that everyone who has a CD player has listened to my Our Lips Are Sealed CD. It just means that if you have a CD player, then you're able to listen to this. So likewise, John 6:44 lets us know that people are able to come to Christ if they were drawn by God, but it doesn't say that all of the people who were drawn by God need to come to Christ. In that verse, it doesn't say that they don't need to come to Christ either. You would need to look elsewhere for that answer. And that's the problem with what Mr. White is doing, because he's saying, no, John 6:44, that says that every person drawn by the Father is raised up on the last day. And if anyone lost respect for me because I own this Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen CD, just know I have the DVD too, so it kind of cancels out, right? Right? Is that how that works? Did this make it worse? This made it worse. Okay, back to it. We have this hymn, which is equal to the people who come to Jesus and who are also drawn, noting that it never says that these are the only people drawn by God. And then we have this hymn, which is equal to the people who are raised up on the last day. So if these two hymns are referring to the exact same group of people, which is what Mr. White is claiming, and we're going with it, we're not refuting that at all. If these two hymns are referring to the same exact group of people, then you can say that these people who come to Jesus, who are also drawn, noting again the fact that it never says that these are the only people who are drawn, are equal to the people who are raised up on the last day. We're not saying that this can't be true. What we're doing is we're pointing out the fact that this hymn refers to specific people. This hymn refers to people who are both coming to Christ and were drawn by God. So to write this as an equation, it could be written x plus y equals z. And again, we're not arguing with that. The thing Mr. White is doing is he's changing this plus sign in the equation to an equals sign. John 6:44 gives us an equation of x plus y equals z. Mr. White is teaching x equals y equals z, which is not found in the text of John 6:44. It's not found in the text of the entire Bible. So even adhering to Mr. White's rule about the same hymns, which we're completely fine with, the question still remains. Why is Mr. White saying that this single verse, John 6:44, teaches us about all drawn people, when there is logically no way to know that from that single verse. And if he is learning this using other verses, then what are those other verses? And why does he keep saying that John 6:44 says this? Why not say John 6:44 and all these other verses put together? The truth is there is no collection of verses that actually teach what he's saying, but again, Mr. White, if you want to try to explain yourself, go nuts. Alright, so on Twitter, Mr. White did not address our actual points, which is understandable because Twitter's kind of hard to communicate on. You get only a certain character length. But anyway, the next day, Mr. White did post his video, so let's get back to that.
But this sort of summarizes it right here. Who is drawn by the Father? Those who are given by the Father to the Son, and then, here's the assertion being made.
Okay, pausing for a minute. Mr. White says over and over again about us making some assertion.
Here's the assertion being made. To even asserting.
And then he reads the slide that we had in our video. Here's the slide. The slide answers the question of who is drawn by the Father. And we say those who are given by the Father to the Son, as well as anyone who is drawn by the Father and was not given by the Father to the Son. But the part that Mr. White left out is that we clearly labeled this as a possibility which was left open by the text. The Bible does not rule out that possibility. We never said that this was taught in John 6:44. So with John 6:44, we have no idea whether this anyone equals 0 people or greater than 0 people. We just know from John 6:44 that there's still a possibility that the number could be anywhere within that range. Now, if it's 0, then Mr. White's teaching can be safe. But if it's any number other than 0, that's the end of the line for Mr. White's teaching. The issue here is, though, that Mr. White's saying it has to be 0. And he's eliminating all of these other possibilities just because Mr. White says so. He has no biblical support for what he's doing. He's closing down possibilities that God left open with the text. So in our video, we weren't even saying that this anyone couldn't be 0. Given just this one verse from the Bible, this anyone could be 0. But Mr. White is saying that this verse means it has to be 0. And that's just not true. The verse leaves open the possibility that there could be drawn people who don't end up coming to Christ, and they don't end up being given by the Father to the Son. Now, Mr. White doesn't believe that a person can be drawn and then not raised up on the last day. But the Bible never voids that possibility. And seeing as the Bible also says, with God all things are possible, and all things are possible with God, and even Jesus is quoted as having said, Father, all things are possible for you, Christians don't have to follow Mr. White and his Protestant ways when he closes off possibilities that God left open. So now back to what Mr. White is claiming that we asserted.
So, to even assert this idea that as well as anyone who was drawn by the Father and was not given by the Father to the Son, there is no category anywhere in John chapter 6 of this.
We know that. We never said we learned this in John chapter 6. We learned this using a deck of cards, not the Bible. We used the cards to demonstrate how you could draw a card and then not give it to anybody. You don't need a Bible to teach definitions of words. See how this slide specifically says this is the Christian teaching, and this slide doesn't use that label? This slide is still a teaching, but it doesn't rely on Christianity. The slide refers to a teaching we just learned about how the words drawing and giving are two different things. You don't need a Bible to tell you that this action and then this action are two different actions. But Mr. White misrepresenting people who don't agree with his false teachings is just par for the course for Mr. White. On Twitter, he went off and talked about the word hymn, as if we were trying to separate the two hymns. But we never did that. On YouTube, he went off and talked about how this slide information was not taught in John 6. We never said that it was taught there. The Bible never tells us that ocean spray makes cran raspberry juice, but that's still a valid teaching. Now, in an ironic twist, while Mr. White is trying to convince his audience that he didn't close off a possibility that was left open by the text of the Bible, he ends up closing off a possibility which is left open by the text of our slide. Mr. White says,
Who's drawn by the Father, those who are given by the Father, Son, as well as anyone who is drawn by the Father and was not given by the Father to the Son. Which would actually mean everybody, when you think about it.
Not when you actually think about it. It could mean everybody, but it doesn't necessarily mean everybody. Again, Mr. White is showing that he's not thinking logically, but let's watch as he works through this one.
Because it's asking, who is drawn by the Father? Those given by the Father, the Son, and those not given by the Father, the Son. That's everybody.
So here's our slide, and here's what our slide would have to say if it actually taught what Mr. White is saying it taught.
It's asking, who is drawn by the Father? Those given by the Father, the Son, and those not given by the Father, the Son. That's everybody.
As explained already, our slide does not necessarily include everybody. That anyone could be equal to 0 or anything greater than 0. And again, that's only if we're looking at John 6:44, because John 6:44 never tells us where we're at on that range. Is it 0 like Mr. White is saying, or is it anything else? So this is just another example of Mr. White closing off possibilities that weren't actually closed off by the text. That all being said, Mr. White and I are fellow Christians. And the Bible says, My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth, and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. So clearly here one of us are wandering from the truth. It's either me or Mr. White. So hopefully, if this becomes a back and forth conversation where Mr. White actually addresses what I'm actually saying, then maybe this can be helpful towards whichever one of us is wandering from the truth. Alright, so if you're coming here from Mr. White's channel, we got you. This was part of our diabolical plan. Click the like button, subscribe, click that notification bell, help this audience grow, share the videos, watch Our Lips Are Sealed.
I think he's trying to rebuild his audience.
And as always here on Christian versus Protestant, if you want to know how to be Christian, just drop the Protestantism and keep the Christianity. You all have a great day. Papa Umau Mauta.